Welcome to See Beneath Your Beautiful, where guests share stories of adversity and perseverance, which inspire, encourage, and challenge us. We embrace these tough conversations, intimately exploring our loves, fears, and hopes with a delicious combination of depth and lightness.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. I'm a big fan of what you're doing with your podcast and sharing of people's stories. So my name is Angela Irwin. I'm originally from the US, but I've lived in France for the past 12 years. And I did a complete career change at the age of 40 and am now a confidence coach where I help women reprogram their self-esteem and self-acceptance to build lasting confidence. And I also, during the pandemic, of all things, started a nonprofit, a 501c3 dedicated to helping my fellow cochlear implant recipients in the US be sure that they can maintain their external hearing components so that they can remain a part of the hearing world.
Explain what the implants are, if you don't mind.
Cochlear implant technology has been around for over 40 years, and yet less than 5% of people who could benefit from this life-changing technology actually have it. And that's a global number. So anything that I can do to raise awareness around that, I am so happy to do. But basically, it is a device. You have to have a surgery. So if you have severe to profound sensory neural hearing loss, you have a surgery, they insert this internal cochlear implant. And then there's also an external component. So it's classified as a prosthetic device. So, here you and I are having this conversation, but if I take off my external component, I am completely deaf.
Okay.
You could bang pots and pans, you could honk, you could, you could whatever. I wouldn't hear it.
Yeah.
And the external component runs on batteries and has different aspects to keep it running. So I liken it to smartphone technology. It's going to be something that's going to need to be repaired, replaced, upgraded across the course of someone's lifetime in order to be able to hear. And it's kind of an interesting thing because we, as cochlear implant recipients, we set up our whole lives around being able to be part of the hearing world.
What does that mean?
So our communication, our families, our work, like I said, having this conversation, watching movies, watching TV, it's all dependent on that technology, which is, sometimes a little bit scary that we're so dependent on it. But it's absolutely life-changing because without it, I would not be able to communicate with the hearing world.
You were born with no hearing loss.
Correct.
And then what happened with that?
Good question. To this day, we do not know. I was born with normal hearing. And another sort of interesting fact is that 90% of babies that are born deaf are born to normal hearing parents.
Oh, okay.
90% of parents don't know anything about hearing loss or deafness when those babies are born. For me specifically, I was born with normal hearing. Thankfully, I grew up in South Dakota and we had hearing tests at the start of every school year. In kindergarten, it was fine. In first grade, they detected a mild hearing loss. And, my parents were baffled. There was never anything. And that was sort of a unique aspect because normally with hearing loss, if you're not born with it, if it wasn't a genetic thing, you either had like a high fever or something had to have happened. And that wasn't the case with me. And so my parents took me to an ear, nose, and throat doctor, audiologist. And at that time they said, well, it's just a mild hearing loss. We'll just monitor it. And the odds are it will not progress. Mm-hmm. Well, famous last words, because over the course of the next 15 years, I slowly lost all of my hearing and we have no idea why.
What was that like to go from hearing to no hearing?
It was pretty scary, to be perfectly honest. And
so you were a teenager while this was happening?
I was starting around 8 years old. So I was pretty young. Mm-hmm. And I got my first cochlear implant at the age of 22, just after I finished my undergraduate degree. So from the age of 8 to the age of 22 was not very carefree, if I'm being perfectly honest.
Yeah.
I never wanted to talk about it. I had tremendous shame around it, which I know it doesn't make any sense, but that's how you feel when it's happening to you. I kept thinking there must be something that I'm doing or not doing. Like, why is this happening? Every year, then my parents would take me to have a hearing test. Like they said at the beginning, we'll just monitor it. So once per year, usually during summer break, they would take me, and every time the audiologist would say, it's gotten worse. And they would always say the same two things. We don't know why this is happening. We've never seen this before in a child. Mm. Now, perhaps I shouldn't have been in the room every year when we got that report, because what I took on as a child was like, holy cow, you are so flawed. You are so broken that none of these people, and my parents took me, like I said, I was growing up in South Dakota. They took me to North Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska, like everywhere, trying to figure out why this was happening. And it was always the same response. And so as you continue to hear that over and over, particularly as a child, I took that on as that you're so flawed, you're so broken that no one can figure out what is quote unquote wrong with you. So I just kept it to myself. That was the way that I could. I think it was a coping mechanism. If I didn't talk about it, or if it wasn't addressed, then it wasn't really happening. I could just go one day at a time. But obviously in hindsight, that probably wasn't the most healthy thing either.
Did you pretend you could hear?
Yes. And also in hindsight, I do not recommend that. I do not recommend it. It was so embarrassing, and just the shame. As it progressed, it also changes your ability to speak. Oh, it's just so fascinating to me. But as you lose your hearing, you lose your ability. If you can't hear it, you can't reproduce it. And so by the time I was, in about junior high age, when you're going to summer camp and you're meeting people, new people for the first time, and they would ask me the question, why do you talk funny? And so then that was a really quick and fast lesson, and just keep quiet. Keep quiet. You don't want to call any attention to yourself. Just keep quiet. Someone would ask a question and I wouldn't understand. I wouldn't want to ask them to repeat. So then I would just answer what I thought I heard. And that's a dangerous thing to do. And then, there's still the stigma very much alive and well around hearing loss, and just assuming that people are not smart because they answer wrong. This is an invisible sort of, you don't expect a 10-year-old girl to have hearing loss or a 15-year-old girl to have hearing loss. You would first think, oh, she's just really not smart.
That's so funny. I like mostly that it cracked you up just thinking about it.
It was so ridiculous. I'm like, oh, I totally have this. That was my master plan. At one point, I'm like, I know what I'll do. I'll just answer yes or no. To any question. I thought I had it all figured out. I was probably 12, you know how 12-year-olds are. And well, of course, then, my, parents would have friends over or something like that. And they would say, what grade are you in? And I would answer yes or no. And you can just see the look of confusion. And then I was confused and I'm like, oh no. But yeah, I thought that was going to be the easy way to not have to stress about understanding what someone was asking. But no, that didn't work.
I interviewed somebody who was born with one small hand, and she spent her lifetime, most of her lifetime, she doesn't do it now, but hiding her hand in her pocket. And even, she said, during sex, she would hide it under pillows and blankets and stuff. So what do you want to say to people who are hiding a disability or something that's different or that they're ashamed of? What's your message about that?
That's such a great question. And that is really what I'm on a mission for, because it's now the thing that I felt the most shame and embarrassment and wanted to hide. I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me before I wanted anyone to know that I was losing my hearing. And it's no different for anything else. But what I have learned is we're not meant to fit in. That almost really, the idea that we're taught to be like other people or to fit in and change somehow warp ourselves into some box that doesn't exist is so damaging. And I really, really wish that I had a mentor or someone who would have been able to say, no, just embrace who you are, embrace your differences, because we all go through things. There's not a person on this earth who hasn't gone through challenges, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about fitting in and looking a certain way or being a certain way or acting a certain way. Instead, we should share how the experiences of whatever it is that we went through have shaped us. And the majority of time, it has brought out compassion. It has brought out a humanness in us that we otherwise wouldn't have found. And I know it's easier said than done. And I'm a late comer to that party. I was in my 40s before I fully understood this and embraced it and now encourage others to do it. Just share more of who you are.
Yeah.
Share your gifts. Share what you're going through. I'm a huge fan of Brene Brown, and about vulnerability is sheer courage. It is. It takes so much more courage to be like, this is me. Mm-hmm. This is the thing that I'm challenged with, or this is the thing that has happened to me. It takes so much more courage than hiding and pretending, but that is also exhausting as well.
Right.
It's so freeing when you can just be like, this is me. And I still marvel at the thought of that little girl, the teenager, even up to, like I said, I was 22 when I got my first cochlear implant, would have done anything to hide what was happening. And now I'm just like, hello, world. I have cochlear implants. Let me tell you about them. Let me help you. It's so freeing just to not be living or trying to hide a massive part of yourself.
I was sexually abused as a little girl and I didn't talk about it. My family didn't talk about it. And I went to a counselor, but I remember saying that we don't need to talk about that because it's in the past. And I don't want to be a victim of my past, which is so wrong because talking about it freed me. I really love what you're saying, that it really is, so what? That happened and so what? But not sharing it was what made it so impactful.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I 100% agree. And what actually brought this to a head for me was when I did the career change. So I had 15 years in the corporate world, working and living on 3 continents, traveling. It was all great. And I made a career change. My position was made redundant. And so there was some knowing, there was some, you call it whatever you want. People say a calling, your intuition, whatever it was. But even 2 to 3 years before I was laid off, I was like, there's something more I'm supposed to be doing. But it's super busy. I'm traveling all over. The money was good. Had I not been laid off, I would not have taken that pause and gone, okay. Mm-hmm. So I did do that. And then what happened was I went in, I found my way to life coaching. I enrolled in a year-long dual life coaching certification program, plus how to set up an online business. And within 3 months of that program starting, I went into complete shutdown. I was in undiagnosed depression for the first time in my life. And it was because I had never dealt with any of that. 15 years of hearing loss. We never spoke about it. I got a cochlear implant. Life went on.
Yeah.
But none of that was ever dealt with. And so here I have this mentor telling me, okay, you need to be visible and you need to go out and tell the world that you're doing this. Well, what happens is the body remembers, right? The body remembers the trauma. And so all I could think about was she saying be visible is back to the teenagers when I'm meeting kids at camp and they say, why do you talk funny? And I went into total shutdown.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I did get some professional help. And I can remember, this is exactly what you're saying, the first time that the therapist said to me, we need to work through this trauma. And I was like clutching pearls, like trauma? It wasn't trauma.
Right. Exactly.
I was thinking it's this massive thing. Gabrielle Bernstein, as an example, she will say trauma with a capital T or trauma with a small t. And so whatever. But you look back and you go, okay, yeah, I guess I can see how someone would say that was traumatic. But it was only during that process, because, when he first said, we need to work through this trauma. And I was just like, no, there's no trauma. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine.
What do you think about doing the work? For me, saying it was terrifying, and then now it's not at all. It was the shame that I carried that was keeping it in my body. And then once I shared it and it was no longer scary and it wasn't this shameful secret I had to keep, freed me. So what do you think about doing the hard work? Do you have a message about what it's like to go through and talk about your trauma?
I'm in agreement with you 100%. It was the hardest thing. It was harder than losing my hearing for 15 years. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
But it's the best thing I ever did, the hardest thing I ever did. But now it can be on the other side of it. And like you said, there is the freeing. There's a physical difference in the body. And I know it may be hard to understand that if you've not gone through it before, but there's a physical lightness of freeing that because we're carrying this luggage. We're dragging this luggage and this baggage with us from decade to decade to decade. It doesn't go anywhere. As much as we may want to think we don't need to address it or it's in the past and whatever, we're still dragging that heavy stuff with us. When I did my TEDx talk, I don't recommend doing this, but that was part of the healing.
Oh, yeah.
I was sharing stuff in that TEDx talk that I had never shared with any other human being. And I don't recommend it. Like I said, my mom was in the audience hearing this information for the first time. My right leg was shaking so badly that I thought, oh my gosh, when this video comes out, they're going to be able to see that, like, they're going to think I have some sort of like quirk or something happening. And then the other beautiful thing that happened, it has nothing to do with hearing loss. It has everything to do with what we each have gone through. Everyone has gone through something. When I shared with people for the first time that I was like friends with since I was in, second grade or whatever, they opened up back. They were sharing their trauma, whether capital T or small t. And I think that's where that vulnerability piece comes in. That made for deeper connections with friends that I would have considered my best friends for my whole life. That was just like, okay, I'm going to open up to you. You open up to me. It was just absolutely amazing. And like I said, I know it is not easy. It is tough to do. But when you can come out on that other side, you will be better for it, what I believe.
In your TED talk, you mentioned that you were suicidal at one point. Do you want to talk about that?
Again, I think this is a coping mechanism because I needed to somehow feel in control of my future. Let me preface it by saying that I was told I wouldn't graduate from high school. I was told I wouldn't be able to go to college. I basically had no future, if you want to just put it that way.
Yeah.
And I was, of course, fighting that with everything in me because I was just like, somehow, some way, this is all going to magically work out. And it did, fortunately for me, and that this cochlear implant technology had evolved and I was able to get it. But during that time, I think I needed to somehow feel in control. And I just thought, look, if I have no future, I grew up in a small town in South Dakota, population 1,200 people on a farm. Mm-hmm. And I did not like it. I would read Danielle Steele's books about, these women, these powerful, strong women with careers, and they're flying all over the world and flying all over the country. And that was what was in my heart of hearts. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of not being able to communicate, not having any future, I was just like, well, then what's the point? And so that was a decision that I made for myself at that time. And it sounds weird to say it. I understand that, again, if you haven't been in that situation, it was almost a little bit liberating to know that I had a plan because everything else was outside of my control. Now, fortunately, of course, that day never came, but there was just something about, okay, this is the plan if it comes to this point. To this day, I was just asked this past weekend. The most frequent question I'm ever asked when I tell people I'm clinically deaf is, oh, you must know sign language. If I had $1 for every time I've been asked that question, I would be long retired. So now I've sort of gotten a little cheeky about it because I get it. People just aren't that familiar with hearing loss and deafness and cochlear implants and the whole and sign language and ASL and the deaf community and culture. And it's a lot of layers. It's complex. But I always say to them, "Oh, do you know sign language?" And they seem very surprised and they say, "Well, no." And I'm like, "Well, that's the point." I wouldn't be able to communicate with you. That's the whole point, is like, you don't want to be cut off and isolated. That's the thing about, what they say about hearing loss. It is the most isolating thing a person can experience, because if you can't hear, you start to isolate, you cut yourself off, you don't take part in daily life and that sort of thing. So it's always really interesting to me to get asked that question.
I see. Are you offended by it?
No, because I know people just don't know. And so I take it as a learning opportunity.
I didn't get it either when you first said it, but it totally makes sense that the whole point, though, is that you want to communicate with others, not just the deaf community.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really smart. Obviously, we're so dumb about what we don't know, Thank you for educating us. How are you helping others with your coaching business?
So when I went through that process of going into depression and going to the therapist, and I did not realize that we can change the way that we feel about ourselves. I didn't realize that was something that we could change, that we actually have control over. That blew my mind. I thought either, we're confident, we're born with confidence, or we're not. And that is so not true. And so through that process, I was like, oh my gosh, we can rewrite these false beliefs. We can rewrite these negative beliefs. Now, it is not easy, for sure, as I'm sure you well know.
Yeah.
But it is possible. And that to me was so fascinating. My undergraduate degree was in sociology and psychology. And so I've always been sort of just fascinated about the mind and how we interact and all of those sorts of things. Well, when I realized that we can change the way we feel about ourselves, confidence is something that we can build. It's like a muscle. The more we exercise it, the more, but it's a bit of the chicken and the egg scenario, because people want to wait to do something until they feel more confident.
Yes.
It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. We have to take action first, get out of our comfort zone first. And then we realize, okay, it wasn't as scary. I'm still breathing. And then we go, oh, okay, it wasn't as bad as I thought. And that's how we build that confidence muscle.
Yeah.
So it was through that experience. So had I not experienced that, I would not be in this space at all. I'm the last person who thought they would be helping people with confidence. And what I have learned even further is it's more about self-acceptance. Mm-hmm. It's really that foundation of being able to build lasting confidence is about self-acceptance. So if we're less critical to ourselves, if we have a better relationship with ourselves and toward ourselves, that has a ripple effect, right? If we're our best selves, if we're feeling better about ourselves, we're going to treat others better. We're going to get out of our comfort zones more. We're going to meet our full potential. And so that's what I try to do with the confidence coaching, because I've been there and it is possible. And I think when I talk to people, they're like, oh, I don't think I could do that. And one of the most frequent bits of feedback that I get from my clients is just they really start to reconnect with themselves. They start to appreciate themselves. We're human beings. That's one of the things that I like to say. I don't know where this came from, the idea of perfection. It does not exist. There's no such thing as perfect. So if we can get over that and just be like, I'm going to try this and not be afraid to take risks, not be afraid of failure. If you talk to any entrepreneur, they will say failure is where they learn the lesson. So if we can sort of undo some of that programming, then we can just thrive, right? Because we're not worried about what other people think. We feel much better and we're act much kinder towards ourselves. Mm-hmm. We're not having the negative self-talk. It just all ripples from there. I was doing that primarily with women. And then as I mentioned, during the COVID, starting the nonprofit. So I'm working with cochlear implant recipients specifically on building their confidence, because there's sort of another subset of nuances that come with, what do you say to people about having a cochlear implant? How do you explain it? Mm-hmm. Do you give them the whole life story or do you give them 30 seconds? There's just different situations where it can be helpful to have someone sort of come alongside and guide you. And as I mentioned, so I've now had my cochlear implants. I celebrated 25 years in May, which is hard. It's amazing to think about that. So I've now had cochlear implants for longer of my life than I haven't had them. And so it's been really wonderful just to help share that knowledge as, people are experiencing having hearing loss and deafness and cochlear implants for the first time.
I agree that I can think differently about my past. I'm 100% on board with what you're saying. You can rewrite your story, but how do you explain to somebody that whatever happened actually happened, but the way you feel about it can be different? I know that's true because it's true for me. But is anybody saying, well, no, I can't change my past, so I can't have a different story? Have you ever come across that? And what do you say to that person?
That is such a great question. And I come up against that all the time. People just don't believe it can be different for them. And even when you sort of share some of your story, they're like, oh, that's so great. You did that and it worked for you, but it's just not going to work for me. So what I try to do in that situation, I'm planting a seed here and a seed there, and hopefully, have an opportunity to connect with them at a different point down the line. It's a phased approach. It is so much because we just are not taught anything about this. Right. We're not taught. I am fascinated by neuroscience, about how the brain works, how it's meant to protect us, right? But it's actually keeping us from achieving our full potential. I love sharing about that. I love sharing that, this is why when you think about getting out of your comfort zone, your brain is screaming, danger, danger, danger. And so what do? We pull back on the reins. We go, okay, well, this isn't for me. And so just helping people understand that is the normal function of the brain. It's designed to keep us safe. Thank you for that. But it also can really trip us up, right? It can keep us stuck. It can keep us playing small. It can keep us from going after our dreams. It's such a great question. It's just trying to give little doses of it can be different. It doesn't have to be this way. It's not easy. It's simple. This stuff is super simple, but it is not easy. And it requires concerted effort and consistency. Yeah. Because when you achieve like a certain level and you're like, yes, all right. And then like the next thing comes and you have that reoccurrence of like, I thought I dealt with this. Where is this self-doubt coming from? And it's serious business, like no joke. But I also try to be like, okay, we knew we were going to end up back here. Yeah, yeah. But the least time we can spend here. So we don't want to be stuck in that hard, messy, painful place. And I think each time you sort of have this recurrence, if you will, for lack of a better explanation, we build our resiliency. Right. So we have a setback. That is life. There's going to be setbacks. I love that drawing. I'm sure people have seen it, but it's like how we expect to see success. And it's like this straight arrow up. And then the like reality, and it's like, a 2-year-old scribbled on paper. And it's like, that's life. So I think it's important to sort of have appropriate expectations. It's not going to be this straight up arrow. It's going to be 2 steps forward, 5 steps back, a couple steps forward. And I think when you can accept that and have that be your mindset, going, okay, yep, there's going to be challenges, there's going to be setbacks, but in the long run, this is what I want, or this is what I know myself to be, or who I want to be, or who I'm becoming. Mm-hmm. It's really powerful, but it is challenging to do that on your own. So I think it's important for people to have some sort of support, even if it's one friend or just someone else who's going through something similar, or it's like 2 entrepreneurs who are trying to encourage each other on. I think it's really important to have a support network to help you through that.
I just went to breakfast with a girlfriend who owns a business, and one of her core values of her business is that her employees aren't victims. They can be going through shit because she has a lot of employees, and of course they all are. Everybody is. But they can't be victims of it. They can't have a bad attitude. And I thought that was so interesting that that's actually like a core value in her vision and mission statements.
I love that. It is. It's such a mindset thing. And again, we're just not, I wish that this was something that they were teaching in, elementary school, to be perfectly honest.
It would be nice not to have to be midlife to figure it out.
Like, oh, if only I knew this gold before, like how different life could be.
Yeah.
But I think that is such an important thing. And yes, we can all have a momentary pity party.
Yeah.
I was just sharing today with one of my cochlear implant clients. Like I said, I've had this device for 25 years. I know I operate on batteries.
Mm-hmm.
I have to change my batteries probably 4 times a day.
Mm.
And yes, there are those times when I have the little pity party and I'm like, I hate these stupid batteries. That lasts for about 45 seconds. And then I'm like, you better switch that to gratitude and kick your own butt a little bit, right? You're like, okay, because I think that's one of the fastest ways to get out of that victim mentality or yes, the thing happened. And yes, it was terrible and it's unfair no matter what it was, 100%.
Yeah.
But we get to choose our reaction. We get to choose whether or not we live our life based on whatever the thing was. And the fastest way to switch out of that is because the mind cannot hold a positive and negative thought at the same time. So the quickest way to switch out of that is go to something you're grateful for. And that's what happens when I'm like, these batteries.
That's funny.
I wish I didn't have to depend on changing these batteries. And then I'm like, look at the life that you've gotten to live and work on 3 continents, be your guest right now on this amazing podcast. We're having this conversation, all the things, working with my clients. I would not be able to do that without these batteries. So you switch really fast into the gratitude mode.
Yeah, definitely. One of my favorite sayings is that emotions have a right to life. So instead of saying, I shouldn't feel this, so feel it and don't live there. It's okay to feel that way, but don't wallow.
That is so beautiful. And that's such an important part. And that's where that resiliency comes in as well. It's like, okay, when you can bounce back from those setbacks quicker, you have to feel all the feelings now. We know they're not going anywhere. 30 something years of push down. And that exploded in my face, much to my surprise. And right. So the feelings aren't going anywhere. So it's so beautiful what you said. We have to feel the things. Just don't wallow in it. Just go, okay, I recognize that sucks. I wish that didn't happen. Or, I wish it had happened in a different way. But then you go, okay, now how am I going to respond? We have that complete control to control our response at any time. And that's super powerful. Sometimes people, they may never get there, and that's really hard to watch because if it's someone that you care about and you want better for them, but they have to get there at their own pace. And it's an interesting parallel because like with getting a cochlear implant, I actually worked for the manufacturer of the largest cochlear implant manufacturer in the world. I worked for them for 8 years, mostly in the Denver, Colorado office. And as someone who not only worked for the company, but had the technology, I would be out at consumer hearing loss events and trying to explain to people like how life-changing this is. And at first I was like trying to hardcore, like, this is going to change your life. What are you waiting for? Just do it, do it. And it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And some people had a hearing dog. They had all sorts of assistive equipment and whatever. And they're like, no, I hear fine. I get by fine. And you just kind of smile and nod.
Yeah.
And then it was always just so wonderful, though, because you would almost never fail, like maybe 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, sometimes way down the road. You would see these same people at the same trade show, their hearing loss event, and they would have finally gotten their cochlear implant. And they were like, oh my gosh, that's the best thing ever. Why didn't I do this sooner? And you just have to say, well, I'm so glad that you did it now, because people just have to be ready at their own pace. It is really hard, especially when it's someone that is like in your life specifically that you care about and you want something better for.
I'm thinking about if I had heard the things that I needed to hear a decade earlier than I heard them, I wouldn't have heard them. I was open to it at the right time. So I totally get that. I was 35 and ridiculous at one point. So, and then I was 45 and more open to change.
I love that. I was 35 and ridiculous. Weren't we all at some point?
And then luckily you're 45 and you say, oh, well, that 35-year-old deserves love also. That is the key. She made some bad decisions, but she's not worthy of love. That's where I think that real growth comes from.
100% agree with that. We really need to dial in the self-compassion when we're doing any sort of personal growth and development. And just like we did the best we could at that time, most of us in survival mode of some shape or form. And to come back and be relentless and be like, why didn't you? No, that's like the worst thing. It's just come with grace, come with compassion. Be like, okay, well, I know now. Don't wallow in it. It's like, geez, that would have been nice to have lightened that load a decade earlier, but
that would have been,
I wasn't ready to hear it. I wouldn't have heard it. And you go, okay, but the good news is that I do now. And now we can move forward with this new knowledge, which is really important.
I do think it comes all down to love and acceptance. I just interviewed somebody who was saying, I'm not sure if I'm going to get this right, but that she heard Louise Hay say she would have all these different recommendations if it was a business problem or a relationship problem or even a personal self-love problem. And what it all came down to was just one thing. It was all self-love. Because this is not what she said, but because how you do one thing is how you do everything. And more you're forgiving and loving of yourself, you can be open to the world and less judgmental. And that it just radiates everywhere.
I couldn't agree with you more. I say I'm a confidence coach and I talk about self-confidence, but when we get into the work, that's really at the foundation of it. It's really that self-acceptance, that self-love, the being able to be compassionate, the ability to understand there's no such thing as perfect.
Right.
And that's only keeping us stuck. You know, you have procrastination and perfection are the opposite sides of the same coin. That's all going to keep us stuck. And when we can just be like, okay, I'm going to try this. This is my dream or whatever. It's a freeness. I don't know if that's a word. Freeness.
A freeness.
Where you're just like, okay, I'm going to go for this. I'm going to try this. I'm going to be gentle with myself. I'm going to be compassionate with myself. And then we are with other people. Just like you say, how you do one thing is how you do other things, everything. And when you're more self-compassionate, you're likely to be more compassionate to your coworker or to your spouse or to your children because you're like, all right, none of us are perfect. We're all trying. No one's coming with ill will.
Right.
And it has a different feeling. And like I said at the very beginning, that has a ripple effect. It really does.
Really does. I'm just about to start a magazine and I have no idea what I'm doing. And I can't fail because even just creatively, it'll fulfill this desire, this strong, strong desire. So there's no way to fail. It might not be a financial success, but for me, there's just no failure because I'll have fulfilled a desire. Same thing with this podcast. I had been interviewed for a few podcasts and realized I can do it. And so 8 days later, I had a podcast and 75 weeks later, I'm still doing it.
Isn't that amazing?
So I didn't let, could I fail? I don't know enough. None of that get in the way. I just learned as I went.
That is such a beautiful story and kudos to you. Obviously, this podcast has been a huge success. The magazine will be a huge success. And that is such a beautiful place to be coming from because you're like, well, I can't fail because I'm going to at least learn something along the way. I'm going to fulfill this creative desire that I have. There's no failure in this at all. You're going to release content through the magazine, just like you've done through this podcast. It's going to affect people and impact people and inspire other people.
Exactly.
They're going to be like, oh, okay, I'm going to follow suit. I'm going to try something and I don't know what I'm doing. I think that's also something that really keeps us hung up. And that's where you find a mentor, you find a collaborator, you watch the YouTube videos, whatever it is, that you need to do. And I think I love that. I love that mindset. I love that perspective. So I'm super excited to see your magazine.
Thanks. It is actually born from this podcast. It's the same idea that we all go through things. And so It's about emotional storytelling. It's about that we can go through things and come out the other side. And you're the perfect example. So thanks for being a guest on my show.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and have a discussion with you. And I'm super excited to continue to watch you. And I think it's just so important and so inspiring for people to have examples and have real life examples. And when you hear story after story, you're like, okay, maybe I can do this too. And that is just so invaluable.
I agree with you. And that's about you as the guest, because you've gone through some things and you can do anything you want. That you can be at one point suicidal, think there's nothing to live for, and yet you're a success living in France. I mean, what a dream. So I just love that. That's the whole point of the podcast. So thanks. You're a perfect guest.
I just really appreciate people who are trying to share their trauma, capital T, small t, and turning that into something that helps other people. So I really appreciate that.
This is something I had to learn too. And you were saying this about that we're all just people and we all have something. I'm not doing anything novel. There's plenty of podcasts where there's been through something and you come out the other side. But because I'm me with what I have to offer, it's valuable.
Yeah.
That's also a self-acceptance that I have something worthy of sharing.
100%.
From my own unique perspective, even though it's nothing new. I'm saying that because as a younger woman, I wouldn't have even believed that. I wouldn't even have thought that I could do this because what do I know? But I know what I know and it's valuable.
Absolutely. And even though there might be other podcasts with a similar theme, no one can do it the way that you're doing it.
Right.
And I think that's the other thing and I have to remind myself of that too and whatever, but it's like the world needs all of it.
Yes. There's more than one life coach out there, but Byron Katie and Eckhart Tolle, I think, and many others say exactly the same thing, but their delivery is different. And so different people hear what they have to say. You resonate with some and you don't resonate with others, and that's okay.
And like you say, sometimes it's just a matter of when you're hearing it. Like you could hear the same thing from 5 people, but for whatever reason, that 6th time the moment strikes and you're like, oh,
that is so true.
I get it now.
This is my favorite thing is that I keep getting the same life lesson over and over. And I'm like, I think I learned that before. It didn't stick because that's like an aha, even though I know I heard that.
And then it's just coming back one more time. We're going to loop back until you get this lesson. Yeah.
Until it sits in the heart rather than just in the head.
That's a great way to describe it.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of See Beneath Your Beautiful, hosted by Hara Allison. And thanks for your ratings and reviews. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Stay tuned.